There is a kind of pain that does not leave when the moment is over. It leaves the room, but not the body. It fades from the conversation, but not from the heart. It stops happening outside you, yet it keeps happening within you, quietly, repeatedly, almost faithfully, as if some part of your inner world has learned how to reproduce suffering, even when life is no longer actively delivering it. You tell yourself that this time is different, that you are older now, wiser now, more careful now. You promise you will not fall into the same pattern, will not believe the same lie, will not give your peace away in the same way again. And yet, somehow, the same pain returns. Maybe it wears a different face, a different relationship, a different disappointment, a different fear, a different season of life. But the emotional shape of it feels strangely familiar. The abandonment, the rejection, the anxiety, the emptiness, the guilt, the feeling of not being enough, the ache of wanting to be seen and not being met, the exhaustion of hoping things will finally change and then watching the same wound open again. This is one of the most confusing experiences a human being can have, because when pain repeats, it begins to feel personal in a deeper way, not just unfortunate, but woven into identity. You start wondering whether life is trying to tell you something cruel, whether healing is for other people, whether you are secretly attracting suffering, whether your heart is broken in some permanent way, whether God is silent, whether change is possible, whether this pain is simply what your life is going to keep becoming. And beneath all those questions is one very quiet, very honest one. Why do I keep suffering the same pain again and again? Not just, why does life hurt? That question is ancient enough and difficult enough. But why this pain? Why this pattern? Why this inner repetition? Why this strange cycle in which the same wound seems to find you no matter how much time has passed, no matter how much you thought you had learned? This is where spiritual teaching becomes necessary. Not because spiritual teaching removes human pain. It does not. Krishna never promises Arjuna a life without conflict, without grief, without loss, without bewilderment. What Krishna offers is something more powerful than avoidance. He offers vision. He teaches Arjuna how to see suffering clearly enough that it no longer has to rule him unconsciously. And if you listen carefully, the Bhagavad Gita gives one of the deepest answers ever offered to the question of repeated pain. Because, according to Krishna, we do not suffer only because difficult things happen. We suffer because the mind becomes attached to patterns of identity, desire, fear, memory, and false selfhood. We suffer because we return again and again to the same inner confusion about who we are, what can save us, what we need, what we fear, and what we think life owes us. And until that confusion is seen clearly, pain does not merely visit us. It repeats us. This is why two people can go through similar events and be transformed differently by them. One carries the event as a lesson, the other carries it as a living wound. One feels sorrow, but remains inwardly awake. The other becomes bound to the pattern the sorrow awakens. One grieves and moves. The other keeps reliving the same emotional world through new circumstances. What repeats is not always the event. What repeats is the consciousness through which the event is experienced. And this is where Krishna begins. He does not start with behavior. He starts with identity. On the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Arjuna is overwhelmed, but not only because of the war before him. He is overwhelmed because the war has activated everything inside him that he does not yet understand. Fear, attachment, moral confusion, grief projected into the future, love entangled with identity, duty blurred by emotional collapse. He looks at the field, but he is not seeing clearly. He is seeing through the storm of the mind. His body trembles, his bow slips, his mouth dries, his thoughts become tangled. He sits down in despair. This matters because the Bhagavad Gita does not begin with a peaceful person asking about enlightenment. It begins with a human being breaking under the pressure of unresolved inner conflict. Arjuna is not weak because he suffers. He suffers because he is human. But Krishna refuses to let Arjuna mistake his current mental and emotional state for the deepest truth of who he is. This is the first key to understanding why pain repeats. Pain repeats when we build identity around the wound. If rejection happens and the mind turns it into, I am unworthy, then future experiences will be filtered through that conclusion. If loss happens and the mind turns it into, nothing stays, so I must cling harder, then future love becomes frightened and desperate. If betrayal happens and the mind turns it into, I can never relax again, then trust becomes contaminated before it even begins. If disappointment happens and the ego turns it into, I must control more, then life becomes a battlefield of tension. In other words, the event ends, but the interpretation continues. And according to Krishna, it is this confusion between the passing event and the eternal self that keeps suffering alive. He teaches Arjuna that the true self, the Atman, is not destroyed by passing circumstances. It is not the body, not the surface mind, not the emotional storm, not the social identity, not the temporary success or failure of worldly life. It is the witnessing consciousness, the deeper self, the indestructible reality beneath all change. This is not a poetic idea. It is a spiritual revolution. Because if you believe you are the wound, then every pain confirms you. But if you begin to see that pain is arising within awareness, then the pain, however real, is no longer the total truth of you. This distinction is everything. The mind says, this happened to me before, so it will always happen again. Awareness says, fear is speaking. The mind says, I am always abandoned. Awareness says, an old wound has been activated. The mind says, this pain proves something is wrong with me. Awareness says, a painful belief is moving through consciousness. The mind makes pain into identity. Krishna breaks that spell, and yet this is only the beginning. Because someone might say, even if I am not the wound, why does it still come back? Why does the same pain keep finding me? Why do I keep reacting in the same ways? Why do I keep ending up in the same emotional place, even after insight, even after prayer, even after time? Krishna's answer goes deeper. He explains that the mind moves according to conditioning. It dwells on certain objects, certain fears, certain desires, certain memories, and from that dwelling, attachment arises. From attachment comes craving. From craving comes frustration. From frustration comes anger, confusion, delusion, and the loss of higher intelligence. The soul does not become damaged in its essence, but the mind becomes bound in pattern. This is one of the clearest explanations of repeated suffering. Repeated pain is often not only caused by life, it is caused by what the mind keeps returning to. Return creates grooves. Attention creates pathways. Emotion strengthens memory. And whatever is not consciously illumined becomes a cycle. This happens in obvious ways and subtle ones. A person who is unloved may keep seeking love from people who cannot truly meet them, not because they consciously want pain, but because the nervous system has confused familiar pain with familiar reality. A person who felt invisible may become addicted to approval, and every absence of validation becomes a fresh wound. A person who lost control once may begin trying to control everything, and life keeps hurting them precisely because life cannot be controlled. A person who equates worth with achievement may suffer the same emptiness after every success because the soul cannot be fed by the fruit of ego alone. Krishna would say that until the underlying attachment is seen, the forms may change, but the suffering will rhyme. The world will seem to repeat the wound because the consciousness is still organized around it. This is why repeated pain is not always punishment. Often it is revelation. Life reveals again and again the place where we are still unconscious. And because most people do not like this idea, they miss its mercy. They think repetition means failure. Sometimes repetition means invitation. Not an invitation to more pain, but an invitation to deeper seeing. What is this pain asking me to see about my attachment? What false identity does it keep exposing? What desire does it keep making visible? What fear is still governing my choices? What am I still demanding from life that life cannot promise? Where am I still looking for permanent peace in temporary things? These are not easy questions, but Krishna does not offer easy comfort. He offers liberating truth. One of the deepest reasons pain repeats is that we keep asking the world to give us what only the soul can contain. We ask relationships to heal our inner emptiness completely. We ask success to secure our worth. We ask recognition to quiet shame. We ask control to remove uncertainty. We ask pleasure to cover restlessness. We ask outcomes to give us identity. We ask people to become the final answer to a spiritual hunger. And because the world cannot permanently carry that burden, the same disappointment comes again. Not because love is false, not because work is meaningless, not because achievement is evil, but because none of these things can safely hold the weight of the soul's deepest longing. This is why attachment creates suffering in the Gita. Not because caring is wrong, but because clinging confuses the temporary with the ultimate. When you cling, you turn the changing world into a god and then feel betrayed when it behaves like the changing world. The same pain repeats because the same illusion repeats. The illusion that this person, this job, this image, this success, this answer, this timeline, this outcome will finally save me from the human condition. Krishna breaks that illusion not to make Arjuna cold, but to make him free. Freedom in the Gita is not the absence of relationship or action. It is the absence of bondage within them. To love without possession, to act without slavery to result, to serve without needing identity from the service, to remain inwardly rooted while life continues changing. So if the same pain keeps returning, Krishna would not ask only, what happened again? He would ask, what are you still attached to within what happened? This is the more difficult and more healing question. Because when you begin to see attachment clearly, repeated pain stops being random. You begin to see the architecture. You see how the mind keeps making contracts with life. If they love me, I will finally be safe. If this works, I will finally be enough. If I can prevent this loss, I will finally have peace. If I am chosen, I will finally stop suffering. If I get this right, I will finally rest. And every one of those sentences contains a burden that no external condition can fully carry. So, life, almost compassionately, keeps disappointing the contract, not to break the soul, but to awaken it. There is another reason pain repeats, and Krishna points to it with great precision. The mind remembers selectively, but the deeper patterns remain active. A person can say, I know this relationship is unhealthy, and still return. A person can say, I know overthinking never helps, and still obsess. A person can say, I know this success will not heal me, and still chase it compulsively. A person can say, I know I should let go, and still cling with all their strength. Why? Because understanding something intellectually is not the same as being free of its energetic hold. The Gita does not reduce suffering to a lack of information. It sees suffering as a mixture of ignorance, conditioning, identification, and attachment. This is why repeated pain cannot be healed only by analysis. You can understand your wound for years and still live from it. What heals is deeper than explanation. Krishna offers several paths toward that deeper freedom. The first is discernment. To repeatedly remember, I am not merely the passing contents of my mind. I am not every fear, every memory, every emotional surge. These move through me, but they are not the deepest self. This may sound simple, but it is a profound practice. When the old pain returns, most people disappear into it. Krishna teaches you to witness it, not coldly, not by suppressing it, but by seeing it clearly enough that it does not become the total atmosphere of reality. The old abandonment wound rises. You notice it. The old shame rises. You notice it. The old fear of being unseen rises. You notice it. The old hunger to be validated rises. You notice it. Each time you notice, rather than merge completely, you weaken the cycle, because awareness interrupts unconscious repetition. The second path Krishna offers is disciplined action without attachment. This matters more than many people realize. Repeated pain is often sustained by repeated action patterns. The same reaching, the same avoidance, the same compromises against Dharma, the same panic-driven choices, the same emotional bargaining, the same refusal to tolerate uncertainty, the same attempt to secure peace through external control. Karma Yoga changes this. It teaches you to act from truth rather than from the wound. That is a different life. The wound itself says, do whatever stops the discomfort. Karma Yoga says, do what is aligned. The wounded self says, cling harder so you do not lose. Karma Yoga says, act sincerely, but release what you cannot possess. The wounded self says, make this outcome your emotional oxygen. Karma Yoga says, offer the action, not your soul, to the fruit. This is how patterns begin to change. Not merely by feeling differently, but by acting differently from a deeper center. The third path is devotion. This may be the most tender answer Krishna gives, because repeated pain often makes the heart self-enclosed. The mind becomes obsessed with its own wound, its own story, its own fear, its own unmet need. Everything starts revolving around the injured self. Even healing can become another form of self-fixation. Bhakti breaks this enclosure. When the mind turns toward Krishna, toward the divine, toward love beyond ego, something opens. The pain is not denied, but it is no longer the only center. The heart remembers a reality larger than its own repetitive suffering. This is why remembrance matters so much in the Gita. Remember the self. Remember Dharma. Remember the impermanence of all passing states. Remember Krishna. Remember that the soul is not abandoned even when the heart feels alone. Remember that what repeats in the mind is not always what is most true in reality. Devotion gives the wound a larger sky to exist within, and this changes how suffering moves. Not all at once, not magically, but genuinely. A person who brings repeated pain into devotion stops feeding it only with fear and interpretation. The pain becomes prayer, the confusion becomes offering, the ache becomes a doorway instead of only a prison. This is one reason the Gita remains so alive. It does not tell people to become less human. It teaches them how to be human without being ruled by unconscious suffering. Still, there is one more truth that must be said. Sometimes the same pain returns because we have not yet fully accepted the lesson hidden inside it. We want life to remove the feeling without requiring inner transformation. We want peace without surrender. We want freedom without detachment. We want love without vulnerability. We want maturity without grief. We want awakening without the death of illusion. But Krishna's teaching is not cosmetic. He does not help Arjuna feel better so Arjuna can continue living from the same confusion. He leads him through a deeper seeing that changes the way he stands in life. This is what repeated pain may be asking of you too. Not just relief, transformation. What if the pain keeps returning because the old self keeps returning? What if the suffering is not proof that you are cursed, but proof that the false place from which you have been living is no longer sustainable? What if the repetition is not the end of hope, but the exhaustion of illusion? These are sacred possibilities, and they require courage. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend not to see it. Once you see the attachment, you are invited to release it. Once you see the false contract, you are invited to stop making it. Once you see how the wound has become identity, you are invited to remember a deeper self. This is not easy. There may be grief in it. There may be loneliness in it. There may be the trembling that comes when an old pattern no longer feels livable, but the new consciousness is not yet fully stable. Arjuna trembles too. This is important to remember. Spiritual clarity does not always arrive with immediate emotional comfort. Sometimes it arrives like a sword. Sometimes it cuts illusion before it brings peace. Sometimes it asks you to stand in truth before your feelings have fully reorganized around it. But that does not make it less merciful. It makes it real. So, if you keep suffering the same pain again and again, do not begin by asking what is wrong with you. Begin by asking what is repeating in consciousness. What identity am I still protecting? What fear is still directing my choices? What outcome am I still worshipping? What attachment am I still calling love? What memory am I still allowing to define the present? What does my mind keep making true because it has repeated it so often? Where am I still asking the world to save me from a suffering that only spiritual awakening can heal? These questions do not condemn. They illuminate. And in illumination, repetition begins to lose its power. Because what is unconscious repeats with authority. What is conscious can be transformed. This does not mean you will never feel that pain again. It means the next time it comes, it may no longer find the same version of you waiting for it. That is healing. Not the total absence of old pain, but the gradual disappearance of the old self that used to be ruled by it. The old pattern says, "Here it is again. I am back in the same suffering." Wisdom says, "The pain has returned, but I do not have to become it." The old pattern says, "This proves nothing changes." Wisdom says, "This is another chance to respond from truth." The old pattern says, "I must fix this immediately." Wisdom says, "Let me see clearly before I act." The old pattern says, "I am alone in this." Wisdom says, "Krishna is present even here." This is how liberation becomes practical, not in abstraction, in the moment of activation, in the return of the old feeling, in the exact place where repetition used to take full control. That is your battlefield. And that is why the Gita matters. Because Krishna does not speak only to ancient warriors. He speaks to anyone whose mind has become a battlefield of repeated pain. Anyone who is tired of suffering the same wound through different names. Anyone who is ready to stop calling repetition destiny when it may actually be unconscious attachment. Anyone who senses that life is asking for something deeper than endurance, something like awakening, something like surrender, something like freedom. And perhaps the deepest comfort in all of this is that Krishna never tells Arjuna that his pain makes him unworthy. He teaches him in the middle of it. This means your repeated pain is not disqualifying. It is not proof that you have failed the spiritual path. It may be the very place where the path becomes real. Because the moment you stop merely asking how to get rid of the pain and start asking what truth the pain is revealing, the cycle begins to loosen. The moment you stop building identity around the wound loses some of its throne. The moment you stop making the same inner contract with life, life stops needing to break it in the same way. The moment you remember that the self is deeper than the suffering, suffering no longer has total authority. And slowly, perhaps very slowly, the repetition becomes less exact. The space between pain and reaction widens. The awareness strengthens. The attachment softens. The devotion deepens. The self remembers itself. This is not instant, but it is holy. And maybe that is the answer. You keep suffering the same pain again and again, not because you are doomed, but because consciousness repeats what it has not yet fully seen, surrendered, and outgrown. Pain returns where attachment remains. Patterns return where identity remains confused. Wounds repeat where the mind keeps asking the world to resolve what only truth can heal. But this can change, not by force, not by denial, not by becoming numb, but by seeing clearly, acting differently, remembering deeply, and offering even your pain into the light of the divine. That is the movement Krishna invites. From unconscious repetition to conscious living. From wounded identity to deeper selfhood. From attachment to freedom. From suffering as fate to suffering as revelation. From the same pain, again and again, to a new way of standing in the middle of life. If this message reached something real in you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so these teachings can continue reaching people who are caught inside patterns they no longer want to live from. And if you carry an old pain that keeps returning, do not rush to condemn yourself for it. Bring awareness to it. Bring truth to it. Bring prayer to it. Bring Krishna to it. Because repeated pain may feel like a prison,